On September 27th, 1986, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, attempted to break a world record and raise money for charity by releasing 1.5 million balloons into the sky all at once. It was supposed to be a spectacular, feel-good event, a moment of joy and community pride that would put Cleveland on the map for something positive. Instead, it became an environmental nightmare, a public safety disaster, and one of the most spectacularly ill-conceived publicity stunts in American history. This is the story of Balloonfest '86, when Cleveland's ambitious balloon launch went horribly, tragically wrong. In the mid-1980s, Cleveland had an image problem. The city had been the butt of jokes for years. The Cuyahoga River had famously caught fire multiple times due to pollution. The economy was struggling. The weather was depressing. Cleveland was often called the mistake by the lake. The United Way of Cleveland wanted to change that narrative. They wanted to do something big, something spectacular, something that would generate positive publicity and raise money for their charitable programs. They needed an event that would make people forget about burning rivers and economic decline, and instead associate Cleveland with something wonderful. Enter Balloonfest '86. The idea was simple but ambitious. Release 1.5 million helium-filled balloons simultaneously from downtown Cleveland. It would break the world record for balloon releases, previously held by Disneyland with 1.4 million balloons, generate massive media coverage, and raise funds through sponsorships and balloon adoptions, where people could pay to have their balloon included in the release. The United Way hired a professional balloon company, Balloon Art by Treb, to organize the event. The company's founder, Treb Heining, was known for creating spectacular balloon displays for major events. He had done balloon releases before, though never on this scale. The plan was to construct a massive mesh structure in Cleveland's public square, fill it with 1.5 million biodegradable balloons, and then release them all at once in a coordinated moment of spectacle. Volunteers would spend days inflating balloons and loading them into the structure. What could go wrong? As it turns out, almost everything. The preparation for Balloonfest '86 began days before the scheduled release. A huge 3-story tall mesh net structure was erected in Public Square in downtown Cleveland. It looked like a giant covered dome, designed to hold the balloons until the moment of release. Over 2,500 volunteers worked in shifts to inflate the balloons. They used helium tanks to fill balloon after balloon after balloon, 1.5 million of them in various colors. The balloons were tied off and pushed up into the mesh structure, where they accumulated in an ever-growing mass of color. The atmosphere among volunteers was festive. People were excited. Local media covered the preparation. Sponsors were happy. The United Way was thrilled with the publicity. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But there were warning signs that organizers either missed or ignored. First, the weather forecast wasn't great. A cold front was moving into the Cleveland area, bringing the possibility of rain and wind. Meteorologists warned the conditions might not be ideal for a balloon release. Second, there were logistical concerns about the sheer number of balloons. Some volunteers questioned whether releasing 1.5 million balloons into the environment was really a good idea, even if they were supposedly biodegradable. The organizers dismissed these concerns. Third, and most critically, the Coast Guard had requested that the release be delayed or canceled because they were conducting a search and rescue operation on Lake Erie. 2 fishermen had gone missing, and the Coast Guard, worried that 1.5 million balloons floating over the lake would interfere with their search efforts. The United Way organizers faced a difficult decision. They had invested enormous time, money, and effort into Balloonfest '86. Sponsors were committed. Media was assembled. Volunteers had worked for days. Delaying or canceling would be embarrassing and expensive. They decided to proceed. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1986, thousands of people gathered in and around Public Square in downtown Cleveland. The crowd was huge. Estimates ranged from 50,000 to over 100,000 spectators. Families with children, tourists, media crews with cameras. Everyone wanted to witness the spectacle. At approximately 1:50 p.m., the moment arrived. With a countdown and a roar from the crowd, the mesh netting was released, and 1.5 million balloons exploded into the sky. For a few seconds, it was spectacular. An enormous, colorful mass of balloons rose into the air, creating a visual unlike anything most people had ever seen. It looked like a rainbow erupting from the ground. Cameras captured the moment. People cheered. It seemed like the event was a success. But then the weather turned. The cold front that meteorologists had warned about arrived right as the balloons were released. Instead of drifting up and away as planned, the balloons hit cold air and began to descend. The rain started. The wind picked up. And 1.5 million balloons began falling back down to Earth, not in some distant location, but right over Cleveland and Lake Erie. Balloons landed everywhere. They covered the city like colorful snow. They clogged storm drains. They littered streets, parks, highways, and neighborhoods. They washed up on beaches. They floated on the surface of Lake Erie in massive, colorful blankets that stretched for miles. And then the real problems began. Burke Lakefront Airport, located right on the shore of Lake Erie, had to shut down temporarily because balloons were covering the runways. Pilots reported visibility issues. The airport spent hours clearing balloons before normal operations could resume. Highways around Cleveland became hazardous as drivers encountered balloons blowing across roads, sticking to windshields, and creating distraction and confusion. There were multiple accidents attributed to balloon-related visibility issues. But the worst consequence was on Lake Erie itself. Remember the Coast Guard's search and rescue operation that organizers had been warned about? The one they decided to proceed despite. It became a nightmare. The two missing fishermen, Raymond Broderick and Sulzer, had been out on Lake Erie when their boat capsized. The Coast Guard had been searching for them when 1.5 million balloons descended onto the lake's surface. The balloons created a carpet of color on the water that made it nearly impossible to spot people or debris. Coast Guard helicopters and boats couldn't distinguish between balloons and potential survivors. Every time they spotted something in the water, it turned out to be balloons. The search became exponentially more difficult. Tragically, both fishermen's bodies were eventually found washed ashore. They had drowned. And while it's impossible to say definitively whether they could have been saved if not for the balloons, the Coast Guard made it clear that the balloon release had significantly hampered their search efforts during the critical hours after the men went missing. The wives of the two fishermen later sued the United Way and the organizers of Balloonfest of '86, arguing that the balloon release had interfered with the search and rescue operation and may have cost their husbands their lives. The lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. But the problems didn't end there. The environmental impact was severe. While the balloons were marketed as biodegradable, that didn't mean they disappeared quickly. Latex balloons can take months or even years to fully break down. In the meantime, they created massive pollution. Balloons washed up on beaches throughout the Great Lakes region for weeks and months afterward. They contaminated waterways. Wildlife, particularly birds and aquatic animals, ingested balloon fragments or became entangled in balloon strings. There were reports of dead birds and fish that had consumed balloon material. Farmers in the surrounding area reported livestock getting sick or dying after eating balloons that had landed in their fields. The balloons covered pastures and farmland, creating a cleanup nightmare for agricultural communities. The balloons also caused property damage throughout the Cleveland area. They clogged gutters and drainage systems, leading to localized flooding. They damaged cars by sticking to paint and windshields. They created fire hazards by interfering with power lines. Cleanup efforts took weeks and cost far more than anyone had anticipated. City workers, volunteers, and cleanup crews spent countless hours removing balloons from every imaginable location. And even after intensive cleanup efforts, balloons continued to turn up for months afterward. The media coverage that the United Way had hoped would be so positive turned overwhelmingly negative. Instead of celebrating Cleveland's achievement, news outlets focused on the disaster. Headlines mocked the event. Late-night comedians made jokes. Cleveland became a national punchline, once again exactly what the event had been designed to prevent. The United Way of Cleveland faced severe criticism and public backlash. The charity's reputation took a significant hit. Donations dropped. The organization had to issue public apologies and deal with lawsuits and regulatory investigations. Balloonfest of '86 became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing spectacle over common sense, about ignoring warning signs in pursuit of publicity, and about the unintended consequences of large-scale events. So what went wrong? How did an event that seemed harmless on paper turn into such a disaster? First, there was the fundamental environmental problem. Releasing 1.5 million of anything into the environment is going to have consequences, biodegradable or not. The organizers either didn't consider or didn't care about the environmental impact. Second, there was the weather issue. Meteorologists had warned about poor conditions, but organizers proceeded anyway. If the balloons had risen high into the atmosphere and drifted away as planned, many of the problems might have been avoided. But the cold front trapped the balloons low and brought them back down over the immediate area. Third, there was the failure to listen to the Coast Guard's warning. This was perhaps the most egregious mistake. The Coast Guard explicitly asked for the event to be delayed because of the ongoing search and rescue operation. The organizers refused, prioritizing their event over public safety. 2 men died, and the balloon release very likely hindered efforts to save them. Fourth, there was a lack of proper planning for contingencies. What was the plan if the weather turned bad? What was the plan if the balloons didn't disperse as expected? There didn't seem to be adequate backup plans or risk assessment. Fifth, there was the scale. 1.5 million balloons is an almost incomprehensible number. At some point, quantity becomes its own problem. The organizers seemed focused on breaking the record without fully understanding the implications of releasing that many objects into the environment. The aftermath of Balloonfest. '86 had lasting effects on mass balloon releases. In the years following the disaster, environmental awareness about balloon pollution grew significantly. Many cities and states began banning or restricting mass balloon releases. Today, mass balloon releases are illegal or heavily restricted in many jurisdictions. Environmental groups actively campaign against them. Organizations that once regularly used balloon releases for celebrations or memorials have largely moved to alternatives like planting trees, releasing butterflies, or using biodegradable lanterns. The balloon industry itself has changed its practices with more emphasis on responsible use and disposal. But the damage to the industry's reputation from events like Balloonfest at '86 was significant. For Cleveland, Balloonfest, '86 remains an embarrassing chapter in the city's history. It's often cited as an example of a well-intentioned idea gone spectacularly wrong. The irony is painful. An event designed to improve Cleveland's image instead reinforced the negative perceptions the organizers were trying to overcome. But Cleveland has also learned to embrace the story with a degree of self-deprecating humor. The city has worked hard in the decades since to improve its image through genuine economic development, cultural investments, and environmental restoration. The Cuyahoga River, which once caught fire, is now clean enough to support fish and recreation. Balloonfest. '86 has become a piece of Cleveland lore, not something to be proud of exactly, but something to acknowledge and learn from. Looking back at footage of the event, it is surreal. You can see the excitement and anticipation in people's faces as the balloons are released. You can hear the cheering crowd. For those first few seconds, it really did seem magical. And then you see the balloons beginning to fall. You see them covering the ground and the water. You see the realization dawning that something has gone very wrong. The mood shifts from celebration to confusion, to concern. The photos of Lake Erie covered in a blanket of colorful balloons are striking beautiful and horrifying at the same time. It looks almost surreal, like a strange art installation. But knowing that somewhere beneath that colorful carpet, 2 men were drowning while rescuers struggled to find them, makes the images deeply disturbing. The volunteers who spent days inflating balloons had no idea they were contributing to a disaster. They thought they were helping a good cause, creating something positive for their city. The spectators who came to watch thought they were witnessing something wonderful. Even most of the organizers genuinely believed they were doing something good. And that's what makes Balloonfest in '86 such a complex story. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't intentionally harmful. It was a failure of judgment, a failure to adequately assess risk, a failure to prioritize safety and environmental concerns over publicity goals. In the end, Balloonfest '86 teaches us several important lessons. 1. Good intentions don't excuse poor planning. United Way wanted to do something positive, but they didn't think through the consequences. 2. When experts warn you about problems, whether it's meteorologists, Coast Guard officers, or environmental scientists, you should listen. 3. Bigger isn't always better. Breaking a record might seem impressive, but at what cost? 4. Environmental responsibility matters. What we put into the environment doesn't just disappear. It has consequences. 5. Sometimes the best way to improve your reputation is not through publicity stunts, but through consistent, meaningful work over time. Balloonfest. 86 was supposed to be Cleveland's moment of glory. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about hubris, poor planning, and the dangers of prioritizing spectacle over substance. 1.5 million balloons went up, and Cleveland's reputation came crashing down. The balloons have long since degraded. The physical evidence of Balloonfest of 86 is gone. But the memory remains a colorful, cautionary reminder that sometimes the biggest ideas can have the biggest consequences. And 2 families still remember the day they lost their fathers and husbands, lost at sea, while 1.5 million balloons made finding them impossible. That's the real cost of Balloonfest in 86. Not the cleanup, not the embarrassment, but the 2 lives that might have been saved if the event had simply been postponed.